Welcome to Mark's Moments Video Library. These videos are intended for the exclusive use of our agents here at Realty Executives, Arizona Territory. The videos are designed to be a brief overview of frequently asked questions and topics from our agents. If you are in need of a more in-depth discussion on any of the topics in our video library, please call one of our members of our management team. The information on these videos is intended to be used as a guide, not a substitute for legal advice. Thank you.
Start over. Welcome to another installment of Mark's Minutes. I'd like to talk today a little bit about the on-site wastewater treatment addendum and septic inspections. It's always one of the least fun things to talk about, but it's something we have to address. And on the contract acknowledges whether or not there is a septic system or not. If there is, then there should be an on-site wastewater treatment addendum accompanying the contract for the buyer. There is an Arizona Administrative Code, which has the effect of law, which requires that all sellers must have a septic system inspected prior to transfer, and it's within 6 months prior to transfer. And the ownership and transfer must be transferred to the buyer within 15 days of close of escrow. It cannot be waived. A buyer and seller, even on a cash transaction, may not waive it. Two people cannot agree to break the law, and it's one of those things. So it has to be done. Even if the owner seller is a bank, it must be done. So the seller has to have the septic inspected, and normally that will require it to be pumped in order to be inspected. The on-site wastewater treatment addendum kind of picks up where the Arizona Administrative Code leaves off. So what if there are repairs to be made? Who's going to do that, and who's going to pay for that? So the on-site wastewater treatment addendum fills in that gap. So in the event there are repairs to be made using the proper addendum, the seller will be required to pay up to 1% of the purchase price for any repairs. So if you represent a buyer, be sure to use the on-site wastewater treatment addendum. If you represent a seller, just be advised that it cannot be waived. It is a rule, code, law, whatever you want to call it, but it is a requirement for every seller to transfer every septic tank. So if there's more than one septic tank on a property, that would apply to however many septic tanks there are. If you have any further questions, feel free to contact one of us in agent support. Thank you. Hello, another Mark's Minutes for hopefully a little bit of information that you can use. I'd like to talk a little bit about the FHA VA amendatory clause, what it is, what it isn't. The FHA VA amendatory clause is required for all FHA and VA loans. And in the past, it's required to be signed by the buyers, the sellers, the agents. And it's never really been a problem too much in the past, but now with all the buyers negotiating to get the properties, sellers market, buyers waiving appraisals or agreeing to pay above appraised value, you have to be careful that you don't misunderstand the amendatory clause. It may not save your buyer if the buyers agreed to pay non-refundable earnest money. So if a buyer agrees in the contract that they will pay the difference between the appraised value and the contract price, or pay some portion thereof, then the amendatory clause will not bail them out. Again, if the buyer agrees to have the money non-refundable and then the seller refuses to sign the amendatory clause, then the buyer probably won't get the loan, and the unfulfilled loan contingency also may not save the buyer. So you've got to be real careful with that. It's the amendatory clause is not a law. It's a guideline from HUD, but it's not like a law or a statute. It's a guideline, it's a rule, but it's not a law. So again, you have to be careful that you don't misuse it and misunderstand it. I think there are sometimes agents believing that they can write anything and have earnest money non-refundable as long as they have an FHA or VA loan where they have an amendatory clause. But again, be careful, and you need to understand it, get a copy of it and read it. If you have any questions, feel free to give me or someone else in leadership a call. Thank you. Hello, welcome back to Mark's Minutes. And today's topic is earnest money and additional deposits. When you are representing a buyer, you'll have a certain amount of earnest money that you will deposit in escrow. And at some point you may make some money non-refundable, or there might be an additional deposit of funds to escrow prior to closing. So if you represent a buyer, you want to make sure that when you agree to pay additional cash deposits to escrow, that it's labeled as additional funds towards down payment and or closing costs. You don't want it to be additional earnest money, because what the contract says, if the buyer is in default or breaches the contract, the seller may keep the earnest monies as liquidated damages. So you want to separate the earnest money from any additional deposits so that the seller doesn't try to claim all the money that's been deposited. Again, the earnest money is specifically what it's called, earnest money, additional deposits. Be real careful, label it that this additional 10,000 or whatever it is would be towards down payment and or closing costs. And if you are not sure, again, please give one of us a call in leadership and we would be happy to help. If you represent a seller, you may want to have the additional deposit labeled as earnest money. So if there is a $5,000 or $10,000 additional funds deposited, then as a seller side of it, you probably want to have it labeled earnest money deposit. So if you're a listing agent and you are generating the addendum or the agreement, you want to state that the additional 5 or 10 or whatever it is, $1,000 is additional earnest money. So in the event of a breach of contract by the buyer, the seller will have claim to all that as earnest monies and not just the earnest money, as opposed to earnest money plus additional deposits. Again, thank you. And any questions, don't hesitate to call. Thanks. Hello, welcome again to Mark's Minutes. Today's topic is anticipatory breach. What is it? There may come a time in your escrow where you represent one party or another. For example, if you represent a buyer and close of escrow is supposed to be tomorrow or the next day, and the seller is stating that they need an extra 2 weeks to move out and they are going to refuse to close, in that case, you could generate a cure notice, and that would be what's called an anticipatory breach. An anticipatory breach is when someone makes a definitive statement that I will or I will not do something now, and it applies to something in the future. Then you don't have to wait till that future date to provide that cure notice. So if somebody gives a definitive statement that they are not going to do something or are going to do something in contract, countering the contract, then you can provide them with an anticipatory breach notice. That way you can save a lot of time. Instead of waiting for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever it is, you can give them the breach now, and then you could have 3 days to see if they cure it or not. So again, anticipatory breach is not used a lot, but when it is needed, it's very helpful. And again, if you have any questions on how to use it or when to use it, feel free to give me or someone else in leadership a call. But it's a very useful tool. Sometimes it can save you or your clients quite a bit of time. If you have a buyer that has the loan denied and they do not have enough time to get another loan, and they say that they will not be able to close on time, then you can send them a cure notice with an anticipatory breach about not closing on time. Make sure that you get that definitive statement in writing, preferably in an email. Verbal is not going to be sufficient. So again, you can do something as simple as sending an email to the other side stating, my understanding is that if the seller does not get the extension they wanted, that they will not be closing in 2 days. Is that correct? And then they just have to answer yes or no. So if you pose the question where all they need to do is give you a brief answer, you're more likely to get a response sooner and in a way that is not contradictory to the way that you would like it. So again, if you phrase it the way you want it, then all they have to do is say yes or no. If they say yes, they are not going to do something, or they know they aren't going to close on time, then you can send them a cure notice based on that correspondence that they stated that they will not be closing as agreed. So then you send out the anticipatory breach, and you saved your side of the transaction, your client, a little bit of time. And sometimes it could be just a few days, but sometimes it could be 2 or 3 weeks. And hopefully that is something you won't need to use a lot. But if you do need to use it, it's a nice little tool to have in your toolkit. Thank you.